The convent bell struck its last chords across the olive terraces as smoke curled over the hills. Red banners broke the skyline like knives against the pale sky. Inside the cloister, Sister Eleni stood with a small wooden cross in her hand and a voice that did not tremble. She told the sisters to keep the vows in the hidden places of their hearts, to hold their names and the prayer lists close, as if they were the only valuables left. It was an exhortation less about resistance than about possession. If they could not hold the convent, they could at least keep what could not be carried away. That morning, when the soldiers appeared, they did not search for chests or relics first. They moved through the chapel with a different aim. They wanted proof that the conquest could be seen on living bodies, in the submission of people who had once been visible in their habits and their hours of prayer. The question that haunted the sisters then, and haunts the records that survive, is not merely what was stolen or burned, but what was taken away from history itself. What the soldiers did, as later documents imply, reached beyond the immediate damage of war. They sought to make a people vanish. The gates did not hold. Cannons had already done their work elsewhere. Here it was, battering and smoke, the sound of wood splintering, and the low, stunned silence that follows a threshold broken. Some relics were hidden beneath floorboards. Others were wrapped and tucked into the folds of tunics. The abbess, known in later letters and remembered in whispered pilgrim accounts as Sister Eleni of Lissa, moved among the sisters, laying hands on foreheads, pressing an abbreviated blessing into palm and brow. She did not ask the young to give up their names. She told them to keep them. When the nuns were gathered, they found themselves not in the presence of simple marauders, but in the formality of conquest. Soldiers counted, ledger keepers took note. Among them was a man whose name would later appear in a ship's tally as Yusuf Aga. In the ledger found in Istanbul archives, his entries are plain and administrative, names, numbers, destinations, yet they become, by virtue of bureaucratic language, instruments of fate. He recorded the sisters' names, the few valuables carried, the numbers placed aboard the vessels bound for Constantinople. The entries that follow are the first hints of the empire's longer plan, not only to take territory, but to reshape lives into records that the state could manage. They were marched to Volos, under a heat that made the olive leaves tremble. Pilgrim accounts and a Venetian dispatch note the convoy's slow, embarrassed progression like a procession of ghosts. On the road, the sisters wrapped their wrists with strips of cloth to protect the skin from the pull of shackles and rope. In the ship logs, there are repeated notations of scant provisions, of quiet, and of women guarded. On the sea, the world shrank. Salt cut at lips already dry from the march. The ships creaked and moaned as if in sympathy. The voyage to Constantinople took 12 days, and each day accumulated a small erasure, a habit changed for civilian dress, a hair shorn for convenience, a name spoken less often. The arrival in the imperial capital turned them into spectacle and statistic. They were paraded through streets, lined with curious onlookers, led past domes and minarets that had only been shapes on the horizon. Venetian letters that reached an anxious consul some weeks later emphasized the public nature of the procession. This was not merely transport, the letters suggest. It was demonstration. The empire wanted witnesses. The conquest had to be visible not only in flags and walls, but in bodies represented as trophies of the state. Before the Imperial Council, the sisters stood in a hall where decisions about souls were discussed as business. There the terms were offered plainly: mercy in exchange for conversion, status and placement in palace households for those who accepted the Sultan's faith. Several Ottoman administrative records, lists used for distributing servants and assigning places in the palace, illustrate the spectrum of outcomes. Some women were given positions of service. Some were assigned to quarters where they were seen and assigned tasks. Others were marked in the ledgers with brief, bureaucratic phrases that would chill any historian. entries such as unfit for service, or the colder shorthand of a blank where a name should have been. These are not theatrical lines in a play. They are the language of an institution practiced at making people disappear without spectacle. The phrase that echoing later chroniclers used, discipline of faith, does not appear as a single legal statute in the surviving records, but it does arise as a pattern. The empire alternated gestures of kindness, shelter, food, and allowance for the practical needs of women now indoors, with subtler pressure, separation from the company of their companions, placement in households far from one another, promises of protection that came attached to assimilation. Such methods are not neat. They do not create instantaneous conversions like turning a light on. Instead, they erode communal life, remove the scaffolding that sustains a religious identity, and rely on an apparatus of paperwork and placement to seal changes into archival truth. Not all reacted the same way. Sister Dearest, an elder remembered in later family letters by a community of refugees, and in a Venetian account as someone who refused to bend, refused to accept offers that would have preserved her bodily safety at the expense of her vow. Letters carried secretly by a friend to a monastery across the sea render her refusal as a quiet but firm breaking of the council's logic. Sister Magdalena, younger and more reserved, took on another role. Where Diaris refused, Magdalena kept memory. She began to speak of names in metaphors, to turn lists into birds, to map each sister into a token phrase that she could carry without attracting attention. "These are the women of our chapter," she wrote in a margin of a later set of notes, whose original is lost, but whose words survive in a Venetian letter. "They are flame and sparrow." It is the kind of language only memory can supply, eyes that translate persons into the portable. Life beneath the palace roofs, in the quarters assigned to those who had not conformed, or who had and now simply existed within the imperial household, became a daily exercise in invisibility. They were servants and attendants, but they were also people catalogued. Ottoman ledgers of the time, used for the disbursement of rations and the assignment of quarters, are meticulous. Names are set beside allowances and annotations. Yet where archivists today find gaps, those absences are themselves significant. An entry crossed out, a name replaced by a code, an annotation like disposed or unfit. These marks speak of administrative choices intended to make social death legible in paper. The bureaucratic language becomes a technology of erasure. The cruelty of this system was not loud. It did not always shout. Instead, it worked in the intervals of daily life. A sister moved to a different wing and never again seen by her old companions. A name no longer appearing in annual lists. An allowance adjusted until the life on which a person could cling became impossible. Letters from Venetian merchants suggest they were aware of these patterns. They note that some women vanished from lists, that servants once listed as nuns were later described as attendants to powerful households. The evidence does not always tell us precisely how each disappearance took place. What the records make plain is the outcome, a legal and social absence. The slow violence of erasure relied on normal administrative functions, assignments, rosters, household lists, that made removal look like ordinary governance. In an empire where rank and place were distributed by document, to be removed from the ledger was to be rendered unpresentable to posterity. Contemporary scholars who would later consult the Ottoman archives would find an economy of names in which some had been transferred, some reclassified, and some excised. The act of removing a name from a list has the same finality in the archive as burning a book. Once the name ceases to appear in the public paperwork, future generations have a harder time reconstructing the life that name once represented. Yet erasure can never be complete. Where official lists grow thin, material traces multiply in silent defiance. Sister Magdalena's response to the tightening of records and the shrinking of community was to leave small, hard tokens of identity in places the Empire did not label. In the dim service passages beneath the palace, corridors of stone and damp, the sisters carved marks. A cross scratched into mortar, a Latin fragment traced into the underside of a step, the worn curl of a rosary bead hidden in a fissure. These are not grand monuments, but they outlast edict and decree. Archaeologists working centuries later would find such traces and begin to map their meaning. When excavations occurred near a now forgotten wing associated in the archives with palace maintenance, what emerged surprised even cautious scholars. Crosses and partial Latin phrases, the sort of shorthand that only those who had once sung Mass would use, were found in sheltered alcoves and beneath flagstones. The finds were modest, not the carved icon of a cathedral, but the small private fetish of a community intent on continuing the rhythm of prayer. The archaeological report, published in a careful footnoted journal, documented these fragments and linked them to ledger notes and foreign dispatches. Together, the material and the documentary formed a composite that argued for human persistence in the face of administrative smoothing. Those carvings do what public decrees cannot. They testify both to the presence that the state sought to erase and to the ways ordinary people preserve what is most essential. Sister Magdalena's marks, simple strokes that in later readings form a line of birds, are not merely artistic flourishes, they are maps. They map not routes, but memories. She is the keeper of the hidden catalogue, a mnemonic device for a community whose conventional archives were being closed or rewritten. Her method was not defiant rhetoric. It was careful, almost monastic economy. A symbol here, a nickname there, a whispered litany beneath the floorboards, so that when one of them was moved or quietly removed, the others would carry the name like a talisman. The ledger attributed to Yusuf Aga proves instructive in its very banality. His entries document the arrival of women from the Thessalian convents, the assignment to the palace, the transfer to households. Later marginalia, likely added by clerks aiming to keep the books tidy, show names relisted under other categories or crossed out altogether. Scholars reading the ledger note that the clerical language is clinical, the cleanliness of ink hiding the moral dirt beneath. A name crossed out might mean death, renaming, assimilation, or something else. Some entries are annotated with a terse, dispersed, or reclassified. The historian's job is then to triangulate. Combine these paired records with Venetian letters that inquire anxiously about sisters known to their communities, with pilgrim notes that speak of an abbess who would not allow herself to be renamed, with archaeological finds that show a cross hidden behind a loose stone. Even the foreign letters have their own reticence. Venetian envoys and merchants were not impartial chroniclers. They wrote for patrons and for profit, and they were attuned to what might best secure sympathy or advantage. Yet their dispatches, when read alongside local ledgers, form a corroborative network. A Venetian letter from 1484, one of the more persistent records, notes that a convent had been taken and names some women who had been seen paraded through the capital. It remarks with a mixture of pity and exasperation that several women had been placed in service and no longer accounted for as a community. These are the sorts of sentences historians underline, not because they are dramatic, but because they are precise. They articulate the administrative effect of conquest. To speak of the worst harm the sisters suffered is to speak of a modality that is both practical and existential. It is practical because it robbed them of community and of the structures that made their beliefs visible. It is existential because it sought to remove the record that would allow their lives to be remembered on the terms they had chosen. The stronger, more visible violence, the locked gates and broken wood, was acute and raw. The more enduring injury was bureaucratic and quiet. Paper, rules, and placement can be as lethal to identity as any sword. Resistance took other forms besides hidden carvings. Prayer continued in small cycles, passed by gestures when speech was dangerous. The sisters developed ways to worship that did not require public confession or open liturgy. A single psalm line hummed under breath, a contrived lullaby that contained a phrase of scripture, a gesture toward the east when the workday allowed a half-second of devotion. These were forms of fidelity that did not appear on payrolls. Where the official ledger declared absence, the body remembered. There were, too, those who made different choices. Some sisters accepted the offers presented to them, whether from appetite for survival, the pressure of separation, or a desire to protect others. A number of names in the palace records appear again, re-identified with household duties and no longer listed as belonging to the convent. The Venetian correspondences sometimes interpret this as conversion, sometimes as pragmatic adaptation. The ledger's neutrality refuses moralizing. It simply presents the results, leaving interpretation to later readers. To accuse a woman in such conditions of betrayal would be to ignore the complexity of survival. To insist that every removal was voluntary would be equally blind. The truth lies in uneven human responses to sustained pressure. What is most striking in the end is the way memory refuses to be fully reorganized by administration. The carved crosses were not large statements. They were small, private acts that escaped the attention of those making the big records. Yet in their smallness, they were durable. Stone holds the impression of a nail, or the scratch of a fingernail, longer than paper holds the ink of a ledger entry. When later hands, those of archaeologists and antiquarians, turned the site over, they did not find proclamations of martyrdom so much as signs of life. The names of saints abbreviated in Latin, a rosary bead tucked in a crevice, a prayer room improvised beneath a stair. Those later readers did the patient work of putting these fragments together. An archaeologist's field report will note the context. A patch of mortar with incised crosses found near a service passage, tied in layout to rooms that the administrative maps identify as quarters for lower palace staff. A diplomatic memo will reference a Venetian mention of a sister, her name recorded with a small flourish in the margin. Combined, these elements allow historians to reconstruct a narrative that the empire had, for a time, attempted to replace. There is a moral thread here about what an empire can conquer and what it cannot. Walls can be taken, bells can be silenced, ledgers can be adjusted. Yet the interior life of communities finds ways to persist, not always in glory, often in loss, in hiddenness, in modification. The sisters' names reappear not always in the way communities wished, but in ways that insist they existed. A cross on mortar, a notation in a Venetian dispatch, Yusuf Agha's ledger, Sister Magdalena's metaphors passed on in a letter smuggled to a remote abbey. These are the resistances that outlast triumphalist narratives. The story invites a quiet humility. Historians cannot and should not claim to reconstruct every detail of what happened to each woman. The archives are incomplete, and silence is one of history's most active forces. But from the margins, from the grooves in stone and the careful entries in ledgers that survived fires and removals, a pattern emerges. Power often seeks not only to capture, but to make its capture definitive by rewriting the lives of those it takes. The worst violence in that moment was not only the momentary suffering of a siege, it was the attempt to turn a living community into a note in a book, easily erased. As the narrative draws to its close, return to the bell. The convent bell no longer rings where it once did. The bell's absence is felt like a hole in the landscape, a musical architecture missing. But the carved crosses in the palace passages keep another kind of time. They mark moments when, in the smallest ways, the sisters refuse to be unmade. The ledger entries that at first glance look like erasures become evidence of systemic attempts to reorder persons. The foreign letters and the careful notes of later archaeologists, placed side by side, reveal a fuller story. One of enforced adjustments and quiet courage. If you want more uncovered histories from archives and letters, subscribe now. Remembering these women cannot be reduced to dramatic episodes. It is an act of forensic and moral patience, reading ink margins and digging beneath flagstones and listening to how metaphors carried names across borders. Sister Eleni's exhortation to keep vows in hidden places was not a resignation. It was a strategy of survival that the sisters employed in different ways. Deiris's refusal and Magdalena's memory-keeping are not opposites, but complementary forms of witness. One makes a public stand that insists on the integrity of a vow. The other enacts a hidden continuity that refuses to let a name be lost to the bureaucracy of power. The lesson lingers beyond the specific century and the specific empire. Institutions wield classification and paper in ways that shape who is visible, who receives attention, and who can be claimed by history. When a state can reclassify a person into a different identity and make that identity the only one the archive knows, a kind of social death is enacted. But the human capacity to leave marks, literal and figurative, remains. When modern hands piece together the fragments, when an archaeologist rubs a fossil of a cross with a brush, and when a scholar in Istanbul reads a ledger that holds the faint smudge of a clerk's hesitation, there is a justice of a sort. It is not retribution, but recognition, an acknowledgement that the attempt to erase did not succeed entirely. The carvings are not triumphal. They are testimony. They speak of endurance in the face of a system determined to make certain lives administratively invisible. In the end, what the soldiers did that was worse than you can imagine was not only the transient cruelty of siege and capture. It was the calculated use of bureaucracy and placement to unwrite lives. That cruelty travels softly through history, through crossed-out names, through blank spaces in ledgers, through the absence of a community where one once stood. Yet memory is stubborn. It hides under flaws. It migrates in metaphors. It is smuggled in letters. It waits until a hand with patience and a brush with time uncovers it. Listen for the bell in the echo of a carved cross. The sound has changed, but it is there, faint, persistent. The stones remember the rhythm of prayer, even when the archives have been edited. The sisters, in their various fates, those who kept their vows openly, those who adapted, those who were administratively erased, left traces that refused to be consolidated into silence. Their witness is not a single voice. It is a chorus of small signs. Share this story and leave a comment about which detail moved you most.